Chapter 14. Smells Like Trouble. It began with a peculiar odour that crept through the Brocket household like an unwelcome guest at a garden party. At first, it was merely a whisper of something unpleasant, hovering at the edge of consciousness. But as the weeks progressed, it developed into a stench that could not be ignored. Mrs. Brocket's nostrils flared as she paced the drawing room. The source of this malodorous affliction must be identified and eliminated forthwith, she declared, her voice carrying the weight of someone who believed they were born to greater things than tracking down mysterious smells. Perhaps it's the drains, Mr. Brocket suggested from behind his newspaper, not bothering to lower it. No, Henry! Mrs. Brocket's voice cut through the air like a poorly wielded butter knife. I have deduced the perpetrator with absolute certitude. It is that wretched girl, Mabel. As if summoned by the mention of her name, Mabel appeared in the doorway, a feather duster hanging limply in her hand. You called, Mrs. Indeed, I did not call, though your timing is most fortuitous. Mrs. Brocket's eyes narrowed. Tell me, Mabel, when did you last engage in the act of ablution? Ablu what? Mabel scratched her head with the feather duster. She means when did you last wash? Isabella translated, rolling her eyes. That ain't none of your business, if you don't mind me saying, Mabel replied, her chin jutting forward. Mrs. Brocket drew herself up to her full height. As the mistress of this household, everything is my business. I hereby declare that we shall conduct daily olfactory assessments of your person. Mother means we're going to smell you, Marianne helpfully supplied, beaming, like when I used to smell the flowers in the garden until that bee flew up my nose. Did you know bees can't sneeze? Catherine looked up from her journal. How romantic! Like perfumers in Paris, testing delicate fragrances. Ain't nobody sniffing me, Mabel declared, backing away. I got me rights, I have. Rights! Mrs. Brocket laughed, a sound like china rattling during an earthquake. My dear girl, you have the right to do precisely as I command. Now stand still while I fetch the chalk. What followed was perhaps the most peculiar ritual ever established in the already peculiar household of the Brockets. Each morning, the family would line up to assess Mabel's supposed odour, with Mrs. Brocket wielding a piece of chalk and a stern expression. She had commandeered a section of wall in the entrance hall where she meticulously recorded each family member's smell score in her spidery handwriting. Today's results, Mrs. Brocket announced on the third morning, tapping the chalk against the wall. Mr. Brocket rates the smell at 7 out of 10, though I suspect he barely removed his nose from his book. I myself detect a solid 9. Isabella claims a 6, but she's being deliberately contrary. Marianne insists on scoring with pictures of ducks, which I have translated to an 8. And Catherine... She paused, squinting at her youngest daughter's contribution. Appears to have written a poem about the smell. It's called Ode to an Unwashed Maid, Catherine said proudly. Mabel stood through these daily assessments with the air of someone watching lunatics perform their morning exercises. You're lots madder than a box of frogs, she muttered, as Mrs. Brocket drew elaborate graphs showing the trajectory of the smell over time. The data clearly shows no improvement, Mrs. Brocket declared, studying her charts with the intensity of a fortune teller reading tea leaves. We must implement more stringent measures. It was during one such assessment that fate intervened, in the form of Isabella leaning against a wooden panel in the wall. There was a creak, a crack, and suddenly the panel swung inward, revealing a dark space beyond. And there, crouched in the gloom, was a filthy man eating what appeared to be a stolen wheel of cheese. After a few moments of stunned silence, the scene that followed was pure pandemonium. Mrs. Brocket released a shriek that could have shattered several nearby windows. Mr. Brocket actually lowered his book. Isabella stumbled backwards into a potted plant, while Catherine dropped her journal and quill. Marianne alone seemed unperturbed. "Oh, how lovely!" she exclaimed. "We have a wall person." "I always wondered who was eating all the cheese. I thought it might have been particularly ambitious mice, or perhaps a very small horse." The man in the wall took another bite of cheese and regarded them all with remarkable composure. "All right," he grunted, his voice rough as a badger's backside. "Got any pickle to go with this?" Mrs. Brocket's face contorted through several expressions before settling on outrage. You vagabond! How dare you inhabit my walls without permission?" "Well, truth be told," the man said, brushing crumbs off his filthy coat, "I did ask permission, banged on the wall thrice I did. No one answered, so I reckoned it were all right." "Get out this instant!" Mrs. Brocket commanded, pointing dramatically toward the front door. The wall dweller settled more comfortably into his nook. "Nah, I ain't going nowhere. Right cosy in here it is. Got all a bloke needs. Cheese, darkness, the odd rat for company. Besides," he added with a gap-toothed grin, "I've taken a shine to your daily sniffing game. Funniest thing I've seen in donkey's years." Mabel, who had watched this entire scene unfold with undisguised glee, burst into laughter. "Well, well, looks like I ain't the smelly one after all, eh, Mrs. B?" Mrs. Brocket's mouth opened and closed several times, one of those rare moments in life when she actually found herself speechless. The chalk slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor, a fitting symbol for her shattered dignity. Mr. Brocket finally spoke from behind his partially lowered book. "I suppose this explains why the cheese bill has been so astronomical lately." "And why my journal keeps disappearing," Catherine added. "Have you been reading it?" "Oh, aye," the wall dweller nodded. "Had a good chuckle at that part about the dashing highwayman with eyes like stormy seas. Bit daft, if you ask me. No proper highwayman 'ud be caught dead wearing purple breeches." Mrs. Brocket finally found her voice. "This is preposterous. This is unprecedented. This is—" "Right bothersome," the wall dweller finished for her. "But you'll have to lump it. Squatters' rights, see? Read about it in one of your husband's law books. Learned a thing or two, I have." As the implications of this statement sank in, Mrs. Brocket's expression suggested she was experiencing several stages of grief simultaneously. The wall dweller took another bite of cheese and disappeared back into his hole, leaving the family staring at the dark space he had occupied. "Well," Marianne said brightly, "at least now we know why the walls sometimes sneeze." The following morning, Mrs. Brocket stood at the front door, preening like a particularly satisfied bird of prey, as two constables trudged up the overgrown path. She had dispatched an urgent missive to the Lesser Mudbury police station at dawn, describing their unwanted resident in terms usually reserved for describing natural disasters. "The miscreant is this way, gentlemen," she announced, ushering them inside with a flourish. "Though I must warn you, the odour is quite penetrating." The younger constable, barely more than a boy with spots, immediately proved her point by turning a delicate shade of green upon entering the house. His senior colleague, a corpulent man whose uniform strained against the evidence of too many meat pies, pulled out a handkerchief and pressed it to his nose. "Right then, where's this vagabond?" The senior constable wheezed through his handkerchief. "In the walls," Marianne supplied helpfully, appearing from nowhere. "He's quite insightful, once you get past the smell. Did you know he can recite all of Catherine's poetry backwards? Though that might be because the words make just as much sense that way." The constables exchanged glances that suggested they were reconsidering their career choices. "In the walls, you say?" The senior constable approached the panel that had revealed their unwanted guest. "Come out now, my good man. Let's handle this civilly." A voice drifted through the woodwork. "Comfy enough where I am, tar very much. Besides, I'm in the middle of me breakfast. Found a bit of month-old ham in the pantry last night." Mrs. Brocket's eye twitched. "Weren't fit for man nor beast, but I gotta say, it went down a treat with that mouldy cheese I nicked from behind the kitchen dresser." The younger constable made a sound like a strangled cat and had to step outside for air. "Now see here," the senior constable said, rapping on the wall with his truncheon. "You can't go living in other people's walls. It's not proper." "Proper?" The wall-dweller's voice took on a mocking tone. "Let's have a gander at this here propriety, shall we? Is it proper for folks to spend their mornings sniffing their maid? Is it proper for the lady o' the house to stash her husband's favourite books 'cause she reckons they make him too clever for her liking?" Mrs. Brocket gasped. "I do nothing of the sort." "That copy of Advanced Principles of Philosophy is behind the loose brick in the kitchen chimney," the wall-dweller called out. "Though I wouldn't go fetching it now. A family of mice been using it as a lending library." Mr. Brocket lowered his newspaper just enough to give his wife a pointed look. The senior constable, whose face had progressed from red to purple, began prying at the wall panel. "Right, that's enough of this nonsense. You're coming with us." The panel finally gave way with a crack, revealing the wall-dweller in all his malodorous glory. The constable reached in to grab him, then recoiled so violently he stumbled backwards into an ancient side table, sending a vase of wilted flowers crashing to the floor. "Good Lord!" he exclaimed, eyes watering. "The smell! It's like someone pickled a skunk in bad ale and then used it to stuff a mattress," Marianne suggested brightly. "I've been keeping a list of smell descriptions. That one's my favourite, though Isabella's essence of decomposed dignity was quite good too." The wall-dweller emerged fully from his hiding place, revealing himself to be a rakishly tall man beneath the layers of grime. He gave a mock bow to the assembled company. "Maybe we could have a chinwag like sensible folk? Over a cuppa, perhaps? I know where Mrs. Brocket keeps them fancy biscuits. The ones she says ain't there when the likes of me come around." Mrs. Brocket made a sound like a kettle reaching boiling point. The younger constable who had ventured back inside took one whiff and promptly fainted. His colleague caught him before he hit the floor, though the effort caused him to turn an even deeper shade of purple. "This is beyond our capabilities," the senior constable declared, fanning his unconscious colleague with his hat. "The smell alone constitutes a form of assault. We'll need to consult with our superiors about proper protocol." "Protocol?" Mrs. Brocket's voice rose several octaves. "What protocol? Remove him at once." "Madam, there are regulations about the transportation of noxious substances. We can't just throw him in the cells. The other prisoners would riot, not to mention the risk of permanent damage to the prison's masonry." The wall-dweller beamed. "How thoughtful of you to care about the house's well-being. I've grown right fond of architecture myself, living in these walls." Did you know this house has 17 different kinds of wood rot? Quite something, ain't it? Mrs. Brocket's face performed a series of complicated movements that suggested she was experiencing several novel emotions simultaneously, none of them pleasant. The senior constable, still supporting his unconscious colleague, began backing toward the door. "We'll return once we've received proper instructions from headquarters, and perhaps some protective equipment, and smelling salts." He paused. "Lots of smelling salts." "You can't leave!" Mrs. Brockett shrieked. "What about your duty to protect decent citizens from wall-dwelling cheese thieves?" "Actually," the wall-dweller butted in, "I like to think of meself as a cheese redistribution specialist. Sounds a bit posher, don't it?" The constables had already reached the door, the senior officer practically dragging his still swooning colleague. "We'll be back," he called over his shoulder, though his tone suggested he very much hoped to be transferred to another county before that became necessary. As the door closed behind them, the wall-dweller stretched contentedly. "Well, that was invigorating. Now, about that tea—" But Mrs. Brockett had already stormed from the room, her exit somewhat undermined by the sound of her colliding with something in the hallway and cursing in a most unladylike manner. "Guess that's a no to tea, then," the wall-dweller called after her. "Pity. I know where she keeps the sugar lumps too, the ones she tells Mr. Brockett ain't around 'cause she thinks he's getting a bit too portly." Mr. Brockett lowered his newspaper completely for the first time that morning. "Top shelf of the pantry, behind the dried beans." "Aye, sir. Care to join me for a sugar lump? Found they're right tasty dipped in bacon fat." Mr. Brockett considered this for a moment, then raised his newspaper again. "I think not, though I appreciate the offer." From somewhere upstairs came the sound of Mrs. Brockett's muffled screaming into what was presumably a pillow. "Lovely echoes in this house," the wall-dweller remarked. "The walls carry sound a treat, especially at night when Mrs. Brockett's practicing her French. Between you and me, I don't reckon Le Chat is supposed to sound like a sneeze." Marianne clapped her hands. "Oh, how wonderful! We have our very own wall critic. Like a theatre critic, but for architecture and family secrets. Do tell us more about the house's hidden treasures." But the wall-dweller had already slipped back into his domain, leaving only the lingering aroma of his presence and the faint sound of cheerful humming emanating from within the walls. The humming, Mr. Brockett noted with raised eyebrows, sounded suspiciously like one of Catherine's more melodramatic poems set to the tune of a popular drinking song. Over the following weeks, the wall-dweller's presence evolved from an outrage to an affliction that spread through the house like an unusually chatty disease. Mrs. Brockett's attempts to dislodge him grew increasingly desperate, each failing more spectacularly than the last. First came the bagpipes. Mrs. Brockett had acquired them from a travelling merchant, convinced that continuous Scottish wailing would drive out their unwanted guest. Instead, the wall-dweller proved to have an unexpectedly tuneful voice and accompanied the screeching with bawdy tavern songs. After 3 days, it was Mrs. Brockett who surrendered, though not before the bagpipes mysteriously disappeared, only to be discovered weeks later, stuffed with what appeared to be several pairs of her finest silk stockings. Next came the ferrets. This plan ended particularly badly when the creatures decided they preferred the wall-dweller's company to Mrs. Brockett's and began fetching him treats from the kitchen. "Your mother's latest scheme has backfired rather impressively," Mr. Brockett remarked to Isabella as they watched Mrs. Brockett chase a ferret that was dragging her best bonnet toward a hole in the wainscoting. though I must admit I've never seen her move quite so athletically." The wall-dweller had grown bold, emerging from his hiding places at the most inopportune moments. He developed a particular talent for appearing whenever Mrs. Brocket was attempting to maintain an air of dignity. "Interesting chat about table settings," he commented one morning, popping out from behind a painting as Mrs. Brocket lectured her daughters. "Though I couldn't help but notice you've muddled your fish knife with your butter knife. Easy slip-up, especially when you're trying so hard to look posh." Mrs. Brocket's eye began to develop a permanent twitch. Even more galling was his sudden assumption of authority over Mabel, who bore it with gritted teeth and muttered curses. "Oi, Mabel!" His voice would drift through the walls. "You missed a spot with that duster, and while you're at it, fetch us some of that nice cheese from the pantry. Mrs. Brocket's been stashing it behind the flour sacks." "Get it yourself, you cheeky git," Mabel would reply, making a rude gesture at the wall that Mrs. Brocket secretly wished propriety allowed her to use herself. "Nobody is getting the cheese," Mrs. Brocket shrieked. "This is nothing less than cheese-based sedition." "Now, now," the wall-dweller's voice drifted down from somewhere near the ceiling. "No need to get your knickers in a twist. By the way, that fancy word you've been practicing, sedition, you're using it right, but you say it like you're talking about some fancy way of sitting." "You assume to have some varied insight for a peasant," Mrs. Brocket sneered. "Don't judge a book by its cover or a bloke by where he squats, ma'am," said the wall-dweller. "Got a sharp eye and ear for things, I have, even if me beard's big enough to lose a badger in." One particularly memorable afternoon, Lady Uppington chose the worst possible moment to pay an unexpected call. She arrived just as the wall-dweller had emerged to help himself to tea, wearing what appeared to be one of Mrs. Brocket's missing nightcaps. "My dear Mrs. Brocket," Lady Uppington said, peering through her lorgnette at the grimy figure casually stirring sugar into his tea, "I wasn't aware you were entertaining unusual company." "He's our wall person," Marianne explained helpfully. "He's teaching me to play cat's cradle with spider webs. Did you know that spiders make excellent string instruments? Though they do get rather cross if you pluck them too hard." Lady Uppington's departure set a new record for the fastest social call in Lesser Mudbury history. The wall-dweller had taken to appearing at family meals, pulling up a chair as if he'd been invited, which he most certainly had not. "Interesting chat about the war with France," he commented one evening, piling his plate with roast beef. "Though I ought to mention, Mrs. Brocket, Napoleon ain't a flavour of ice cream." Mrs. Brocket's grip on her fork suggested she was imagining it embedded somewhere painful. "Found your diary again, Catherine," he announced one day, appearing from behind a curtain. "Lovely poem about the mysterious stranger with eyes like twilight. Though saying his voice is like honey dripped from angels' spoons might be laying it on a bit thick." Catherine's face bloomed with embarrassment, as if she'd been caught reading love poems to the garden gnomes. His appearances became so common that the family began to set an extra place at dinner, if only to prevent him from eating directly off their plates, which he had done exactly once before. "I do wish you wouldn't encourage him," Mrs. Brocket hissed at her family, who had developed varying degrees of tolerance for their uninvited guest. "I find his commentary on the decline of modern society quite insightful," Mr. Brocket replied, "particularly his observations about the correlation between the size of ladies' hats and the depth of their conversation." Mrs. Brocket's retort was interrupted by the wall-dweller's voice from inside the grandfather clock. "Talk Talking of hats, that new bonnet you got from London makes you look like a startled peacock. What's at a run-in with a milliner's explosion? The final straw came when he began offering unsolicited advice about Mrs. Brocket's social climbing attempts. "You're doing it all wrong," he called down from somewhere in the ceiling as she wrote another invite to Lady Uppington. "All this fussin' for approval, it's beneath you. Though not as low as that French in your last letter. Soirée ain't meant to rhyme with dismay." Mrs. Brocket's quill snapped in her hand, splattering ink across her carefully worded invitation. "That is quite enough. Henry, fetch me the matches and that barrel of gunpowder in the cellar." "I believe that's just an empty wine barrel, my dear," Mr. Brocket replied without looking up from his book. "Though you certainly show commitment to solving problems through explosive means." "Then we shall smoke him out like a common pest," Mrs. Brocket declared, her voice taking on the slightly unhinged quality that suggested someone was about to have a very bad day. "Mabel, fetch every smoking object in the house and meet me in the garden, and bring a net." "Oh, how exciting!" Marianne clapped her hands. "Like that time we tried to catch fairies with Father's fishing nets. Only instead of fairies, we're catching a malodorous wall person." The wall dweller's voice drifted through one final time before falling ominously silent. "Better warn you, Mrs. Brocket. Smoke gets to everyone in the house, not just who you're after. But I gotta say, can't wait to see how this plan blows up in your face. I do love your crafty cock-ups." Mrs. Brocket's answering smile would have made a shark uncomfortable. "We shall see about that, my malodorous friend. We shall see." The following morning dawned to find Mabel perched precariously in an oak tree, clutching a large net and muttering darkly about the unreasonable demands of employment. Below, Mrs. Brocket orchestrated what she termed the Great Fumigation, with the manic energy of someone who had finally parted ways with rationality. "Every chimney must be blocked," she commanded, striding across the lawn. "Every window sealed, every crack stuffed. He shall have nowhere to escape except directly into Mabel's net." "Begging your pardon, ma'am," Mabel called down from her perch in the tree, "but this ain't one of your brightest ideas, and that's saying summat." Mrs. Brocket ignored this commentary, too busy directing Isabella and Catherine in the stuffing of window frames with old copies of Catherine's poetry, a task that seemed to please neither the windows nor the poetry. "Now," Mrs. Brocket announced, brandishing a collection of smoking devices that would have impressed a Turkish sultan, "we shall begin the fumigation. Marianne, light the pipes." "Oh, how thrilling!" Marianne exclaimed, applying matches to the assembled pipes and censers. "Like Guy Fawkes' Night, only inside out, though I do hope we don't accidentally summon any smoke demons. I've heard they're terrible house guests and always drink the last of the tea." Within minutes, smoke began to pour into the house through every available opening. The effect was immediate and indiscriminate. Coughing could be heard from within, along with the sound of people stumbling into furniture and each other. "I say," Mr. Brocket's voice drifted out through a partially open window, "this seems rather counterproductive, and perhaps best not risk smoke signals unwittingly declaring war on any neighbouring tribe." The first person to emerge from the house was Catherine, stumbling and dramatically declaring between coughs that she was dying like a tragic heroine in a Gothic novel. She was followed by Isabella, who managed to make even choking look sophisticated, and Marianne, who appeared to be trying to catch the smoke in a jar for future reference. "Stand firm, Mabel," Mrs. Brocket shouted up at the tree. "He'll be emerging any moment now." As if on cue, a figure burst from the front door, enveloped in a cloud of smoke. Mabel, with surprising agility for someone who typically avoided physical exertion, launched herself from the tree with the net extended. There was a brief, chaotic moment involving net, smoke, and flailing limbs, followed by a thud and a series of creative expletives that caused several nearby birds to flee in moral outrage. When the smoke cleared slightly, it revealed Mabel had successfully captured someone in her net. Unfortunately, it was Mr. Brocket. "Ah," he said, peering through the netting with remarkable composure. "I appear to have been caught. How embarrassing for everyone involved." Before Mrs. Brocket could express her frustration, another figure emerged from the house. The wall dweller, looking remarkably unaffected by the smoke, strolled out onto the lawn. "Fascinating try," he commented, brushing soot from his already filthy coat. "Though I ought to mention I spent 3 years living in a chimney in Bath, so smoke ain't nothing new to me. Speaking of mates, you might want to check on your neighbours. This smoke could drift for miles, and I reckon you don't want to get folks riled up." Indeed, several of the farthest of townsfolk were beginning to emerge from their homes, motioning with expressions of alarm and disapproval in the direction of the Brocket estate. "Seize him!" Mrs. Brocket commanded, but Mabel was still attempting to untangle Mr. Brocket from the net, and everyone else was too busy coughing to be of much use. Now," the wall dweller said. "Ain't no need for violence. Though I gotta say, this has been right invigorating. Nothing like a good smoke to really bring out the smell of your natural aroma, eh?" The smell that wafted from him suggested that the smoke had indeed enhanced his natural fragrance, much like adding pepper to a dish that was already inedible. "Mabel!" Mrs. Brocket shrieked, finally losing what remained of her patience. "Leave Mr. Brocket in the net and capture that miscreant." Mabel, who had just finished freeing Mr. Brocket, looked from Mrs. Brocket to the wall dweller and back again. "Right then," she said, with the air of someone who had decided to embrace the absurdity of their situation. "But I ain't doing this for free, mind." What followed was a chase around the garden that would have benefited greatly from sprightly music and increased speed. The wall dweller proved surprisingly agile for someone who had spent months living in walls, ducking and weaving between shrubberies while offering running commentary on Mrs. Brocket's gardening techniques. "These roses are all mucked up," he called as he vaulted over a flower bed. "No wonder they're looking so rough. And that statue of Venus is facing the wrong way. Though seeing as she's in the buff, maybe that's just as well." Finally, through a combination of luck, determination, and the wall dweller stopping to critique the architectural integrity of the garden wall, Mabel managed to drop the net over him. "Ha!" Mrs. Brocket cried triumphantly. "Now, Mabel, drag him to the police station." "All the way to town?" Mabel protested. "In this heat? With him in this state?" "Consider it part of your duties as a comprehensive household servant." "Comprehensive household servant," Mabel muttered. "More like comprehensive sufferer o' your madness." Nevertheless, she began the long trek to town, dragging the netted wall dweller behind her like a particularly pungent catch of the day. Mrs. Brocket followed in the carriage, maintaining what she considered a safe distance while still being able to ensure delivery of their cargo. The procession through Lesser Mudbury caused quite a stir. Shopkeepers emerged to watch, ladies fainted, and several dogs began howling in harmony. The wall dweller, for his part, seemed to enjoy the attention, offering cheerful waves through the netting and architectural criticism of every building they passed. "That shopfront's Georgian style is right cocked up," he hollered to one red-faced owner, and whoever painted that door must have been blind drunk. Or just plain blind. Or both. At the police station, Mabel deposited her malodorous cargo with visible relief. The desk sergeant took one whiff and immediately opened every window in the building. Mrs. Brockett swept in, ready to savour her triumph, only to be met with an unexpected obstacle. "Can't keep him here like this, madam," the sergeant declared, holding a handkerchief to his nose. "He'll have to be cleaned up first. The other prisoners are complaining. Some of them are threatening to turn honest rather than share a cell with him." "But surely—" "No, madam. Regulations are quite clear about minimum standards of hygiene for prisoners. Can't have him contaminating the whole station. You'll need to clean him up first." Mrs. Brockett's face performed a series of complicated movements as she processed this setback. The wall-dweller, still ensconced in his net, began whistling a cheerful tune. "Take him back," the sergeant ordered, already retreating to what he hoped was a safe distance. "Return him once he's been properly cleaned. And please, for the love of all that's holy, use plenty of soap." As Mrs. Brockett settled back into her carriage and Mabel began the long drag back to the estate in front, the wall-dweller's voice drifted out from the net. "Hope you're going to use the fancy soap, Mrs. Brockett. You know, the lavender one you hide in your drawer with them French books you reckon no one knows about." Mrs. Brockett's answering scream caused several more dogs to join the howling chorus, creating what Marianne would later describe as a symphony of frustration with notes of despair and "Ode unwashed vagabond." The bathing of the wall-dweller proved to be an operation of military complexity, though with considerably more screaming and significantly less dignity than most military operations. Mrs. Brockett had commandeered a large copper tub, placing it in the garden at what she deemed a safe distance from the house. "Mabel," she commanded, "you shall perform this most odious of duties. I have provided you with industrial-strength soap, a scrubbing brush, razor, and my old gardening gloves. Try not to faint." "Ain't in me job description to wash and shave vagabonds," Mabel protested. "Your job description is whatever I say it is," Mrs. Brockett replied. "Consider yourself promoted to Chief Vagabond Purifier." The wall-dweller, still confined in his net, appeared to be thoroughly intrigued. "Ain't had a proper bath since I fell in the Thames. Though that weren't much of a bath, more like unplanned swimming. Did you know there's fish down there would have got a taste for boot leather?" The actual bathing process resembled nothing so much as an attempt to wash a philosophical cat. The wall-dweller maintained a running commentary on everything from the water temperature to the historical significance of bathing in various cultures. "Romans had the right idea about bathing," he observed, as Mabel attacked him with the scrubbing brush. "Though I don't recall 'em using so much elbow grease. And I reckon I still needed that bit of skin you just scrubbed off." As layers of grime were gradually removed, something unexpected began to emerge. Beneath the dirt and debris of wall-dwelling, their vagrant proved to be surprisingly handsome. "Good Lord," Isabella remarked, watching from a safe distance. "He's actually rather—" "Dashing," Catherine supplied, already scribbling in her journal. "Like a hero from a novel emerged from behind a disguise of dirt and mystery." The wall-dweller's hair, once freed from its coating of cobwebs and debris, proved to be a rich brown. His features, though currently twisted in mock protest at Mabel's vigorous scrubbing, were decidedly chiselled. "Blimey, I think I can see me own face in the water," he commented. "Odd. I'm used to seeing nowt but darkness and the odd startled mouse." Mrs. Brockett watched this transformation with mounting horror. This was not at all what she had planned. A clean vagrant was still a vagrant, but a handsome clean vagrant was a threat to her daughter's propriety. "Scrub harder, Mabel," she commanded. "Perhaps we can remove the handsome along with the dirt." "Don't reckon it works like that, ma'am," Mabel replied, though she did apply the brush with renewed vigour. Once bathed, the wall-dweller was provided with some of Mr. Brocket's old clothes, which fit him surprisingly well. The effect was startling. He looked less like someone who lived in walls, and more like someone who might be invited to dinner parties, albeit of the unusual variety. "Well, ain't that something?" he said, looking at his reflection in a window. "Looks like I've been accidentally gentrified. Though I gotta say, these shoes ain't half as comfy as me old ones. How's a bloke supposed to skulk proper in shiny leather?" The Brocket daughters had gathered on the front steps, their expressions ranging from Catherine's romantic swooning to Isabella's attempt at disdainful interest. "He looks like he stepped out of one of Catherine's poetry books," Marianne observed, "though I don't recall any of her heroes having quite such a comprehensive knowledge of cheese varieties." Mrs. Brocket, seeing the way her daughters were looking at their former wall-dweller, decided immediate action was required. "Mabel, attach the rope and escort our newly cleaned guest back to the police station. I shall follow in the carriage to ensure his permanent removal from our lives." The rope was tied with perhaps more knots than strictly necessary, and the strange procession set off once again toward Lesser Mudbury. The wall-dweller, now looking like a gentleman out for a peculiar walk, continued his architectural commentary, though this time with more technical terminology. "The Palladian influence on that building is plain as day," he remarked as they passed through the town. "Though they've botched it up proper, like trying to put a silk hat on a donkey." The police station received their transformed prisoner with visible relief, though some confusion. "Are you certain this is the same person?" the sergeant asked, consulting his notes. "Our report mentioned something more along the lines of a walking compost heap." "Oh yeah, that was me all right," the wall-dweller confirmed cheerfully. "Though I gotta say, this clean feeling is downright strange. How do you lot put up with it?" As he was led away to the cells, he turned back to Mrs. Brocket with a surprisingly elegant bow. "Thanks for your hospitality, ma'am. Your walls were right comfy, and your cheese selection top-notch. Though you might want to check behind the library panelling. I might have stashed some Roquefort there for emergencies." Mrs. Brocket's return to the estate was marked by an air of triumph, though it was somewhat dampened by finding her daughters in various states of romantic distress. "But he had such distinguished features." Catherine sighed, adding another page to what appeared to be an epic poem about mysterious wall-dwelling gentlemen. "And he knew so much about architecture," Isabella added, before catching herself and quickly adding, "though obviously that doesn't excuse the cheese theft." "I liked how he could tell what day it was by the texture of the mould on the bread," Marianne contributed. "That's a very practical skill, isn't it? Like having a calendar made of fungus." Mrs. Brocket swept past them into the house, determined to put the whole episode behind her. "We shall never speak of this again," she declared. "The walls of this house shall remain vagrant-free as nature intended." Mr. Brocket lowered his newspaper just enough to remark, "Though you have to admit, my dear, the house seems rather quiet now. Almost too quiet." As if in response, there was a sudden creaking sound from within the walls, followed by what might have been a cough. Mrs. Brocket froze for several moments, taken aback in surprise. Her mind began to race. Slowly, She turned to Mabel. "Mabel!" she barked, her voice tight with barely contained hysteria. "Fetch me that bronze candlestick holder from the drawing room, the heavy one from Lady Uppington." Mabel returned with the holder, Mrs. Brockett snatching it from her with undue force. With movements that suggested she had finally embraced madness, Mrs. Brockett began smashing at the wooden panelling. The wood splintered under her assault, revealing a dark space beyond. Mrs. Brockett pressed her face into the hole, squinting into the gloom. When she turned back to face her family, her expression was one of pure horror. "Prepare the cheese," she finally whispered, her face pale. "It's his missus."